Well, hello again, everyone, and thank you for staying with us, even as the ice storm approaches. I couldn't help but notice Secretary Anderson's mention of potential additional capability for the National Capital Region for missile defense. I wouldn't mind just a little additional snow removal capability myself at the moment, not to mention a better Redskins team. But we'll get to our priorities on what should be in the president's budget and, more generally, what should be the nation's priorities in the discussion. We've got a great panel. I've got just a couple of questions I'm going to pose to them before we go to you, and we'll do all this by 12 o'clock. I'm going to start on the far left. You've already heard from Frank Rose, who I'll begin by introducing as a Knight of Romania. He was instrumental in the negotiations establishing the U.S. missile defense site in Romania, and for that he has been knighted in the great NATO member state of Romania, which is one of his attributes that's not frequently discussed, but I tend to admire greatly. He hails from American University and King's College in London and has had numerous positions in the government, most recently Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance. Important to keep all those words in your head when you try to understand Frank's approach to this kind of subject. And, as you know, senior fellow here at Brookings. Next to him is my favorite supermom, super scholar, and a television commentator in Washington from the Hudson Institute, Rebecca Heinrichs, who is an expert on missile defense, among other matters of nuclear policy in particular. And like Frank and like Richard, she worked on Capitol Hill. In fact, the three of them used to spar a bit in a friendly way en route to some very productive discussions probably roughly a decade ago. And one of the things Rebecca did was to help form the bipartisan Missile Defense Caucus on Capitol Hill, and has done a lot, therefore, to contribute to this debate and to the evolution of our budgets and our technology and our programs in this domain. And then finally, Richard Fieldhouse is a 25-year veteran of Capitol Hill, and now is the president of Insight Strategies, but worked for Senator Carl Levin and then for the Senate Armed Services Committee in a long career there, with missile defense being among his chief focal points, and certainly he knows the programs and the technologies very well. And so I think the simplest way to begin is really just with a big, broad question to each panelist of what strikes them most about the Missile Defense Review. I don't want a primer. Of course, we've already had a pretty good primer from the Secretary, and I assume many of you have already looked at the document or at least press reports. So I would like to ask, what's the single most striking idea in the report, or departure from previous reports, or just the policy that you think requires the most attention? If I could just work down the line. Richard, starting with you, please.
Thanks, Mike. So it seems to me that the biggest change here is we have gone from what people thought of as a ballistic missile defense review, which we had in 2010, to a missile defense review. They've taken the B away from this one because it is not only about ballistic missile defense. So now this new review expands the aperture, if you will, to include not just ballistic missile defense, but also defense against cruise missiles, including advanced cruise missiles, and hypersonic glide vehicles and hypersonic weapons. And that's really quite a large expansion of the missile defense approach and programs in the United States.
Great, thank you. Rebecca.
Sure. If I could just very quickly, just three points. The first one is first of all, there's a lot of continuity from the Obama 2010 BMDR to the Trump 2019 MDR. The things that are different are, one, you now have Russia and China being discussed as threats in the context of regional missile defense, and that's where the hypersonic threats come in. That's different. Not to say that the Obama administration didn't take that into account, but it was not explicit in the BMDR, and we were still operating sort of under this official policy that even our regional defenses were geared towards the threats from rogue states, Iran and North Korea. So that's one difference. The second one is the emphasis of space, as missile defense is dependent on space sensors. It gives a nod towards looking at studying cost and the technical aspect of space-based interceptors, which President Trump mentioned in his rollout of the strategy document. And third, I would say speed. Where the BMDR from 2010 focused on, fly before you buy and trying to kind of go a little bit slower, cancel some of the more advanced technologies that we were working on. This MDR talks about making sure that we are operating at the speed of relevance, the speed of relevance. So we want to go faster. We got to go faster. When we're trying to actually deploy some of these missile defense systems to compete with great powers who do not have the bureaucracy that we have for our acquisition process. We just simply have to go faster. It doesn't talk in great detail about how we're going to do that, but that's certainly something that the MDR highlights and sets out to do. So those would be my...
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to come back to the technology in a minute. But Frank, over to you, please, first.
I would say 2 or 3 issues. The first is, how do you deal with these more advanced threats? Specifically hypersonics and others. And there's an examination of boost-phased intercept and space-based capabilities. I support looking at those capabilities, but I think we also have to remember we have tried boost-phase systems before, the Airborne Laser, the Kinetic Energy Interceptor, and those programs were canceled for a variety of cost, technical, and operational issues. The second issue is, how do you deal with Russia and China's regional missile threat? I think this is a big issue, but I think there are serious questions about the role of missile defense in dealing with those challenges. Now, one thing where I will part a little bit with regards to what Rebecca said is that the Obama administration did have a more nuanced approach with regards to Chinese ballistic missile threats. The 2010 MDR says that the United States would respond to China's regional ballistic missile threats. Different than Russia. It's very much silent on Russia, but there was an evolution. But I think it comes back to this bigger question. Is there a role for missile defense in dealing with these regional threats from Russia or China, or should we focus on other technologies to deal with it? And then third, space. I agree that if we can get a space-based sensor capability to work, it would dramatically improve our terrestrial-based missile defenses. But we should remember, we have tried space-based missile tracking capabilities before in the SBIRS-LOW program, as well as the Precision Tracking and Space Surveillance System. Both of those programs were ultimately canceled for a variety of technical and cost issues.
Excellent. So what I'd like to do, picking up on where a lot of you went in your opening comments, is to explore a little bit more about technology and how we see trends. Because let me state a premise, which you can challenge if you like, and then also ask a question. The premise is that among roughly peer competitors these days, offense has the advantage over defense. I'm just going to put that on the table. In other words, where we seem to be more able to do good things with missile defense these days is against North Korea, a much poorer country with a fledgling capability. And there, perhaps, defense has a halfway decent chance of being successful. But in general, when we look at the Chinese missile threat to Taiwan, for example, we tend to think of it as one we probably can't stop. These are conventionally armed warheads, of course, for the most part, that we presume might be used in an attack in that region. So the premise is that we are starting from a position of offensive superiority. My question for you then would be, where do you see trends going over the next 10 years or so? Because we've seen in the Missile Defense Review a lot of discussion of the threat getting more sophisticated, hypersonics, maneuvering reentry vehicles, other things that could complicate even current capabilities, ability to do their job. But then at the same time, we see a discussion of directed energy, space-based sensors, maybe even space-based interceptors, and some new opportunities that may arise. So to the extent that both offense and defense are improving, which one is perhaps improving faster, if that's even a meaningful frame? Obviously, I'm really just trying to invite a more general discussion of technology trends, but I'll put it in those terms to start and maybe ask you to begin, Richard.
So what I'll do, Mike, is kind of break this down a little bit in the first instance on the homeland defense piece, and then the second being the regional, because they really are drawn distinctly in the review and have been in the past and come out of our policy. So one of the things the MDR does state is that we, as a matter of policy, are not seeking to defend the United States against the advanced long-range missile capabilities of Russia or China, but are focused on defending the homeland against rogue nations, which for all practical purposes means North Korea, because they've been doing an awful lot. Iran is always there in the sort of side box because we're ready if they should pursue an ICBM. So I don't think there's any suggestion that our technical capabilities are such that we could defend against a Russian or Chinese nuclear attack, and that there's a recognition about the stability problems that would be in place. I don't think either country would be interested in that as the outcome. On the regional side, however, there's a big push in the MDR to advance technologies for advanced threats, but those are not the long-range ICBMs from Russia and China. When it comes to regional, sort of the rogue countries, North Korea, Iran, I think we have been developing these systems that we're all familiar with, Patriot and THAAD and the Aegis program, and improving all those. But one of the things the MDR does is to change the emphasis, if you will, of our missile defense to include not only active defenses, but now includes a focus on passive defenses and on offensive attack operations as a component of missile defense. I think logically recognizing we're not going to build up, thousands and thousands and thousands of these interceptors to match all the interceptors that other countries have. So there is a change in emphasis, recognizing, and the MDR is clear about this, that we're not going to have as many interceptors or more interceptors than potential adversaries have offensive missiles. So that's I'll frame it that way.
That's great. Thank you. Rebecca, over to you, please.
Sure. So where to begin? So I think just a couple of things on what Richard said. So the report, it is true that the report makes clear that the Homeland Missile Defense System is still going to be looking to stay ahead of the rogue missile threat, Iran, North Korea. And then it allows for a hedging. So if we need more interceptors, that the president decided to increase the number of ground-based interceptors, that's what we have to protect the homeland against ICBM threats. We're going to have 64 by 2023 at the earliest. The president requested those in 2017. And then the report talks about some different things we're going to do to increase the reliability and the capability of that system. If the administration decides we need to have more interceptors to stay ahead of the advanced threat, then we're prepared to do so by having a third ground-based interceptor site, because we have the environmental impact studies done for that, deciding where we want to put that. Or we could increase the Alaska fields up to, I think, 104 or 104. So those options are there. Something interesting in the report, though it says that that Homeland Missile Defense System is there to primarily defend against rogue states and accidental or unauthorized launches, leaving the adversary silent on that point. We're talking about Russia and China, accidental or unauthorized launches. It also says that the United States is not going to permit any limitations on homeland defense to get ahead of the advanced threat. And as we do have space sensors, which talk to anybody in the administration, from General Hyten at the Pentagon to Dr. Griffin, Undersecretary for Technologies, Research and Technologies, everybody talks about the hypersonic threat. That is just like primary. And they're talking about it mostly vis-a-vis China and the threat that we think that they are really looking at Taiwan. And the DIA recently released a report on the Chinese threat, and it highlights this. And we're worried about them holding our carriers at risk. So that is what they're really concerned about. And having space sensors is the thing that we can do that's really going to give us the ability to have it's called birth to death tracking of these hypersonic weapon systems that fly low to the earth, and that we can't possibly see them if we just have land-based or sea-based systems from birth to death. So we really want to have that capability. Those space sensors are also going to help that Homeland Missile Defense System to help us stay ahead of the threat from North Korea and Iran. As we continue to work on the rogue state threat, you're going to see that line being blurred between rogue states and peer competitors and the sorts of threats that we can do. Not to say that our Homeland Missile Defense System is ever going to be designed to handle every single ICBM that Russia or China could throw at us, but perhaps could get to the point where we are increasing in their minds doubts that a strategic initial attack would be worth the cost. And so you can, though the report, again, I want to be clear here, the report does not say that we're going to be moving to defend the homeland against those peer competitors, but it is rather silent, saying that we're still going to primarily rely on nuclear deterrence for those strategic threats from China and Russia. But it is an interesting, it is interesting to watch as our technologies improve. This hard line that a lot of people like to see between a defense of rogue states and peer competitors is just going to be increasingly blurred because the rogue state threats continue to advance. I'm going to leave it at that, or I'll just keep talking.
Thank you. That was great.
No, thanks, Richard and Rebecca. I think you both made very, very important points, especially the point, Rebecca, that you made on space sensors. If we can get this to work, I think it would dramatically improve our ability to discriminate against more and more advanced threats. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we had 2 previous programs, SBIRS Low and PTSS. They were canceled, but we did have 2 demonstration satellites, the STSS satellites. They were these old SBIRS Low satellites that we found in a closet, and we said, boy, there's something here. And MDA actually launched them, and the information that those demonstration satellites have provided have been very, very good. So I think we should pursue that, but we also need to take into account the lessons that we've learned from our failures. Mike, I see really 2 challenges that we need to be focused on as we move forward on missile defense. First, I think you raised it a little bit earlier with Dr. Anderson, is the cyber threat. There was a big GAO report earlier, I think last year, which basically said there are serious concerns about the cybersecurity of our missile defense systems. Cybersecurity has to be number 1 as we move forward. This is critical. I tend not to silo space, missile defense, cyber, nuclear. Indeed, I think they are becoming more and more integrated. So if we are going to be serious about missile defense, we also need to be serious about cyber because they are interconnected. And the second, and this is a longer-term challenge, is right now I think our hit-to-kill systems can meet the mission that we currently have, dealing primarily with the rogue state threat. But as we move forward, we're going to have to find a way to deal with more advanced threats, number 1, and 2, get ahead of the cost curve. For example, an SM-3 Block 1B missile costs about $9 or $10 million a round. That's very expensive. So we're going to have to look at some new technologies to get us on the other side of the cost curve. One promising technology potentially is directed energy, but we are not where we need to be right now on developing a deployable solid-state laser that can be operationally effective.
I want to follow up on that, please, and then I'm going to have a question on the budget, and then we'll go to all of you. When we think about what's realistic in terms of new technologies, I just want to put a couple of hypotheses on the table and ask you to respond. And we've seen a lot of studies over the years on everything from space-based ballistic missile defense, not just sensors, but interceptors. And we've heard a lot of talk recently about directed energy. Admiral Richardson just mentioned it yesterday in his presentation and interview with me here. But directed energy is, as we all know, subject to the fact that when you're further away from the origin of the beam, or whatever it may be, the beam inherently and inevitably weakens. And therefore, and not to mention atmospheric effects, so the kind of range that we can realistically expect, even for improved lasers, strikes me as probably in the range of miles, tens of miles, maybe low hundreds of miles. With anything that's even being conceived today, I think it's pretty hard to get into the high hundreds or thousands, which means that it's a hard system to think about for homeland defense, unless you could be in space. But space-based laser technology remains extraordinarily difficult. It's essentially putting up a Hubble telescope and a huge laser for every single weapon you need to have, and you have to have them fairly low altitude. because you can't be too far away from the target, which means they keep moving relative to the Earth. So the absentee ratio means that you need to have a lot of weapons in space for any one you might use. That's a long windup. Simply to ask you all, aren't there some pretty significant constraints still on what we can realistically expect from technology? And yes, if we're thinking about a theater defense, or if we're thinking about a specific small country like North Korea, which is geographically small and near international airspace and near U.S. allies, we may have a lot of options. But if we're thinking about, again, a regional conflict against a China or a Russia, leave aside the Homeland Defense mission, just the regional defense mission, it's going to be fairly hard to think that defensive technologies are really going to become predominant in the next 10 years. So that's, again, a mouthful. But I'd ask you to comment on the limitations of some of these new technologies that the report alludes to and hopes a lot from, but where we already know physics and engineering impose some pretty severe constraints. Maybe I'll go in the same order one more time, if I could.
So you've given us a lot to consider, Mike. We had a favorite old joke on the Hill as we considered many budgets where there were requests for funding for high-energy laser development, and it was, high-energy lasers are the weapon of the future and always will be. And what we have seen from many years of efforts, Frank mentioned the Airborne Laser system. We spent over $5 billion on that. That was a Boeing 747 filled with chemicals for a laser with a very sophisticated beam. It didn't meet the requirements. It was Secretary Gates who canceled the program, saying that its technology was not sufficient, that its operating range was not sufficient, that it would have to be so close to an adversary nation as to put the aircraft at risk. And that's not a very good operational concept if you have to put the airplane at risk just to do the mission. Boeing 747 is, a pretty big aircraft, pretty easily visible to radars, things like that. So the way I look at this from a lot of perspective of these advanced technology programs is there's sort of the real and the now, which are the programs we're working on and are in place now, and we're improving them. And then there are the sort of the efforts for advanced technology, which are, the challenges are really significant, especially when you're not talking about ballistic missile defense, where you have a pretty good idea where the missile should be. But if it's now maneuvering threats, that's a great deal more challenging. And so I think the way I would put it is the programs that you talked about, which are directed energy, space-based lasers, things like that, there will be research, there will be studies. I think actually the MDR has 12 taskings and reports in it that are due within the next year to look at a variety of these things. These are not answered questions. This is still very much exploration and seeing what the art of the possible is, but we're not in a position to be counting on any of that today or near term the way this is described. They're still looking out in the future.
So Rebecca, the same question to you, or to paraphrase Ash Carter when he wrote about this 30 years ago, what are the limits of the possible, the realistic limits of the possible?
Sure. Well, I'm not an engineer. I'm the daughter of one, so I've got some of the DNA in there. But I can tell you from all of my briefings and from talking to different engineers what they're saying, and there is a range. There's a range depending on who you kind of talk to. The one thing I will say about the airborne laser is, from my memory, most of the criticisms of that particular program were the CONOPS. It was the 747 flying over places that are going to try to shoot at it. So that was the main sticking point with that particular program. Now, the technology in it, the guts of the thing, was pretty interesting. And in fact, after the program was canceled, it did have a successful test where it was able to shoot down a boosting missile. And so that the laser technology is still interesting enough to keep people very motivated to invest in this technology. Now, there's another directed energy joke that it's always 15 years away, always 15 years away or 10 years away, depending on who you talk to. And we never seem to be getting that number down any smaller. I have seen an increased optimism that we are getting that number down smaller in recent years. Depends on what kind of platform we want to put it on, though. So I'm still optimistic that we are making progress on the directed energy concept for boost phase application. Now, when you talk about space, Most of the conversations I'm a part of when we talk about space-based interceptors are still not, that directed energy would still be further away. We're still looking at kinetic options for space-based interceptors. And on that particular point, that's going to require just a very significant commitment on the part of this administration to make that policy decision to invest in that, to see if we can get an initial program started. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that in this particular context for this subject, we've been talking about the Missile Defense Review as the report, says. We also have President Trump's remarks that he made at the Pentagon for the rollout of the Missile Defense Review, and it was much more ambitious. He certainly did not make the distinction between Russia and China and defending against Iran and North Korea. And that's very interesting and should not be, I think, discounted or discarded. I think he made the remark that we're going to space and we don't want missiles to have any, what was the language he used? Basically that we didn't want to allow them to have any place where they could be without being threatened by an American missile defense system. And so it will be very interesting to see. I don't think that what he said conflicted with the Missile Defense Review, but you have to look carefully at the words used in the Missile Defense Review. And I've laid that out in greater detail if you want to look at that at Hudson Institute, where I'm a scholar. But it's going to come down to what's in the budget. It's going to come down to what's in the budget, what we see, and where Congress can get behind and find some consensus for the balance between investing in mature technologies that we have, giving them what I believe is an absolute necessity, which is space-based sensors. I think that we have kicked the can on that far too many times, and we're out of road. So we need to get space-based sensors. But then if you look at the concept space-based interceptors, some of these sportier things, you're going to have to look in the budget. And as I have been told many times by administration officials, is it might not just be in the Missile Defense Agency budget. I thought Frank made a great point that you have to look across. It's going to be integrated. The space domain, we can't look at it anymore like it's a zone stovepipe domain. It is a military domain. And that is not the fault of the United States. Our adversaries have been very busy in that domain. And so we don't have a choice but to integrate it across domains. So, and with the Space Force, there's going to be some other things, I think, in these other budgets that are going to have applications for the missile defense mission.
Great. Well, I would agree with Rebecca that there have certainly been improvements in the directed energy arena over the past decade or so, especially with regards to solid-state lasers. And we've also seen the improvement of drone technology. But I would argue that there are still significant operational and technical challenges associated with boost phase defense as well as directed energy. In preparing for today's panel, I went back and looked at the 2003 American Physical Society report on boost phase intercept, and many of those same issues that the American Physical Society laid out back in 2003 remain. Now, on airborne laser, yes, the operational concept was very, very difficult. You needed a lot of aircraft, but it was another problem as well. It used a chemical laser, and it is very, very operationally difficult to operate a chemical laser in a war zone. It's just really messy. And that's one of the reasons why ABL was eventually canceled. Yes, it did have a successful test, I think back in 2009, 2010. But from an operational perspective, I think people understood that chemical laser technology probably was not effective. Now, the key question, and this is the question to ask to the scientists and engineers, at some point in the near future, can we develop a small enough solid-state laser that can be deployed on a drone or a ship that has enough power to intercept ballistic missiles or other types of missiles? I'm not sure. I think it's an open question. I personally believe we do have to look at these new technologies, but we also need to be very realistic about what's achievable and affordable.
So thank you. Let me pose my last question, and we'll maybe go in reverse order on this, starting with you, Frank. And you finished on the word affordable. We know from the Missile Defense Review, it says that we spent $15 billion on missile defense in the first year of the Trump administration, partly because we were focused on North Korea. We got a supplemental. We had an acute crisis in 2017. And I don't know how that $4 billion was spent, but if nothing else, I'm glad we sent a message to Chairman Kim that we were aware of the need to be ready. And so I think there was an argument at that point for a plus-up, but the norm has been more like $10, $11 billion, although, Rebecca, you pointed out that now there's going to be a blurring of the programmatic lines to some extent, and I'm guessing that'll be part of your answer. But what's the right number? And we know, again, hearkening back to President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, which was in a different world against a different categorization of threats, but it was not quite as much money as we're spending now, even when you adjust for inflation. I think Reagan's budget was in the $8 to $9 billion a year range if you put it in 2019 dollars. So we're already a little above that. Should we be closer to the $15 billion as a steady state? The peak that we reached early in the Trump presidency, is the $10 or $11 billion number overall about right? Does it all depend on when we get a massive deployable system that might work? How would you frame the budgetary question, especially in light of the fact that we have a $1.3 trillion offensive nuclear force modernization agenda in the works, as well as the distinct possibility of not getting the 3 to 5% real defense budget growth that the National Defense Commission and others have called for as what they think is needed to fund the full defense program?
No, Mike, I think it's all about the Benjamins. I learned about that. One of my attorneys said, that's a key phrase in all the rap music. It's all about the Benjamins. I said, Ron, how do you know that? He goes, well, my kids listen to rap music. I don't listen to rap music. But it all comes down to the funding. I think the challenge missile defense is going to have, number one, at the macro level, is, as you noted, we have some other very, very significant funding challenges in the defense budget. Probably one of the biggest is the modernization of our strategic nuclear deterrent. Now, I've been out there very, very clearly that we need to modernize, we need to maintain a triad, but I've also been very clear is there's only so much money. So I think the challenge that the missile defense program will face is, how do we maintain our current capabilities, at the same time incrementally improve them to deal with evolving threats, and thirdly, look to the future, so to make sure we don't fall behind as the threat evolves. That is going to be challenging at $10, $11 billion a year. What that leads me to think is priorities are going to have to be made. The Missile Defense Review lays out a whole smorgasbord of options. We are not going to be able to afford everything that is outlined in the Missile Defense Review. So that's going to require the Department of Defense and Congress to exercise very, very tight oversight and be prepared to cancel programs which are not performing. And I will tell you, as a former staffer on the House Armed Services Committee, it is very, very difficult to cancel programs. I still have shrapnel in my back from when I tried to kill the Airborne Laser. So we'll have to see whether they'll be able to do it. But it's going to be a big challenge, especially when you look at the overarching defense budget with the recapitalization of our nuclear deterrent, but also our conventional capabilities. Mike, as you and Jim Miller wrote, the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, they all want to grow the force. Something is going to have to give. Whether the executive branch and Congress will be able to make those decisions, that's the open question.
Thank you. Rebecca, over to you. Same question.
I wanted to just mention that back what was 2 years ago, the height of fire and fury, when the rhetoric was kind of going back and forth between Kim Jong-un. I just cannot call him Chairman Kim. I have a hard time doing
enough.
that.
And if you think of something worse, that's fine too.
Well, the president's given me some ideas, but I won't bring them up here. But anyway, Kim. I mean, when the president of the United States and Kim Jong-un were going back and forth with this very heated rhetoric, the North Koreans. My goodness. I mean, the Kim Jong-un has tested more missiles in his time than his father did over the length of his rule. He got to the point where he tested an ICBM that was a monster. It surprised the most diligent North Korea watchers I know of were surprised at the monster of the ICBM that they tested. And so things were getting very, very serious. And that's when I decided to take a trip up to Fort Greely to check out our missile defense system, which everybody was already sort of nervous because all of this was going on, and the site was prepared and on guard to be called to duty, to action if they needed to do that. And I was climbing in and out of the silos and checking everything out. And by the way, GMD has a bad rap, I think, for having a spotty test program. But I will say that of the interceptors that are currently deployed, to give everybody a little bit more maybe confidence in our homeland defense system, of the current interceptors that are deployed, those interceptors are 5 for 6 in flight tests. So it's not the same system that was initially deployed, initially rolled out when the Bush administration got out of the ABM treaty and we rolled out this GMD system. But I think it's funny in hindsight. I chose not to tell my escorts that I was actually pregnant at the time. So I was climbing. Everybody else was already on pins and needles, and here I am pregnant, climbing in and out of interceptors at the height of fire and fury. So I don't know if that was the smartest thing I've ever done. But I will say, in terms of realistic and budget numbers, I think it's a. I don't care if they're in black accounts. I don't care if some of this stuff is, especially on the space stuff that we're doing. But we have to increase the number. So I'm hesitant to give an actual number because I don't know where it's going to be in the budget, and so I don't want to just look at the Missile Defense Agency budget. And everything that goes towards the missile defense mission is going to be determined first by that top line budget. Is it going to be $700 billion or $750 billion? The president now and the Pentagon all say $750 billion is the number that we need. And that's what the chairman, or now the ranking member of the HASC and the chairman of the SASC are saying. The Democrats now that have control of the House think that number is way too high. And so we have to figure out what that number is first before we can even look at, okay, now how do we prioritize the missile defense mission? Now, I think the other thing that the report does, aside from trying to get the missile defense mission out of just this idea that it's just in the Missile Defense Agency budget and that it's integrated across different budgets and different domains. The other thing it talks about, it has a big emphasis on that the missile defense mission contributes to deterrence. Okay, so it's not just nuclear deterrence or conventional weapon deterrence. We want to have defense incorporated as we think about deterring our adversaries. If we can just raise their doubt just a little bit to change their calculus to think that firing on the United States, what we value most, our allies and our deployed forces, if we can get them to change that calculus, that would be money well spent. And so as I think we think about this, especially as the United States is very reluctant and increasingly reluctant to intervene in these military conflicts, if we can really get a more muscular deterrent strategy for some of these adversaries, that would be money well spent. So in the past, I've said that the Bush administration FIDEP, I don't remember the last numbers, the last year that would have been, but it had this around $10 billion for the Missile Defense Agency. So we're very short of that. And so I do not think it's unreasonable that the budget should be around that high of a number. If you're talking about investing in advanced technologies and getting some of this stuff right, increasing the capacity of systems in the regional context, especially as we worry about Poland and our Eastern Central European allies vis-a-vis Russia, and as we are concerned about Japan and South Korea vis-a-vis not just North Korea, but then as we really take into account the Chinese threat. So the number is going to have to be significantly higher than this $7.5–8 billion in the Missile Defense Agency budget.
Thank you. And Richard, same question to you.
So I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian, just state out front, I'm not a believer in a magic number, right? There is no magic number for any of these programs. other than, if you will, what Congress finally decides. That's what the number will be. And we would do very well to remember that always, because that's where the rubber hits the road. That's where the actual programmatic possibility arises when these programs are funded. And I'm a bit of a skeptic, if you will, on just the dollar charts. So, here's how much we spent versus how much in this time. It's about the capability you're trying to acquire and what you need for the mission. And that varies as the cycle of development and deployment and sustainment continue. You know this very well, Mike, about the cycles of funding and how much you have to put in early in a program versus then when you're going to start procurement and operations. So it's not like there's just a steady line or steady funding state for programs, although ideally every program manager would like to have predictable, stable funding. Right. One of the dangers that you have when you have budget peaks is that if you ramp up funding and then the support for those programs does not continue, the funding can fall pretty substantially and cause real programmatic disruptions, and it's really a turmoil to try to keep a program going. So I do want to add a couple of the ingredients in this soup that people should be aware of. One is the Budget Control Act budget caps are coming back. They're going to be in place for 2 years unless Congress waives them, and I wouldn't bet money on that. As you said, we have a considerable budget problem. You also have a new Democratic majority in the House, which I think is going to have a different perspective from its predecessor in the House in terms of funding and defense funding levels and what are their priorities in terms of where the defense budget goes. And there's going to be a big affordability issue with all these other programs we've talked about. And Frank mentioned it, Rebecca mentioned it. All the other things that the Department of Defense wants to do, there's not going to be enough money in their budget request to do them all. And so they're already competing funding sort of challenges within those budget interests. The other thing is a lot of what is mentioned in the BMDR, it's a roadmap. It's not a programmatic document. Right. And a lot of the things they're talking about, as I mentioned, are still being studied or will be studied over the next 6 to 9 months. These are not things that will necessarily be in the FY20 budget, and some of them won't really be ready for funding for several years. They'll have to answer a lot of questions. Is it cost effective? Does it make sense? So I think the budget picture and the affordability questions are really among some of the biggest questions about this. We won't really know any details about what the administration's actual budget prioritization are until the budget request comes out, and then Congress has a chance to really wrestle with that over the year. But my going-in assumption is that it will be challenging to get all of the expected or requested funding to go through easily this year.
Well, let's go to you, please. I think we'll take 3 questions at a time. In a perfect world, we'll have roughly 1 question per panelist, so we can. But you can feel free to identify the person you would like to have respond or not as you see fit. I think we'll start in the back more this time, because so why don't we take the woman in the scarf, and then the gentleman standing up, and then we'll take one more. Let's see who else in the back, and also the gentleman here standing up in the white shirt.
Hi, I'm Theresa Hitchens with the Center for International Security Studies at the University of Maryland, and I want to thank the panel for a comprehensive discussion. I want to ask a question that kind of goes off the practicalities, but more in the realm of questions of actual deterrence and strategic stability. Rebecca, you mentioned that you see this blurring of the line between missile defense against rogue states and new threats from peer competitors. And I see that too in the Missile Defense Review, but more so in what President Trump said. And your contention is that missile defense is stabilizing. And mine is perhaps that that's not true. If you actually look at the potential responses from Russia and China, one would be to increase their nuclear capabilities, to increase their nuclear forces and architectures as a response to what they see as undercutting of their own deterrent and an undercutting of strategic defense. This is particularly true with regard to any move by the United States to move towards space-based interceptors. Russia and China have for 2 decades been saying that moves by the United States towards that would require them to rethink their own nuclear architectures and anti-satellite weapons capabilities. So I would like the panel to address that question of strategic deterrence and strategic stability with regard to putting missile defense more in the spotlight of deterring Russia and China.
Thank you. Gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Sang Min. I'm a reporter from the Radio Free Asia. I want to ask about the North Korean missile threat. I want to know how to see new MDR describe the preparation for North Korean missile threat. So there something changed, some development. So I want to know how to see that. Do you think that is relevant to deter North Korean missile threat?
Thank you. And then over here, please.
My name is Duncan Kellogg, Partnership for Secure America. First, thank you to the panel. This has been incredibly enlightening. This kind of goes to anyone, but Rebecca, you in particular talked about the president's potential decision to look at really investing in space-based interceptors and looking at that as a potential opportunity. Kind of building off of the first question, that occurs to me, and I think many in the audience, that would represent kind of opening Pandora's box with regards to the Outer Space Treaty. So looking at putting interceptors in space, while it might provide an incredible capability, I wonder if you guys can speak to the relevance of whether or not necessarily coming in breach of that treaty, but bringing other countries into the spotlight of whether or not they would decide to put their own capabilities into space, and whether or not that would provide a capability that violates that treaty. Thank you.
Rebecca, you want to begin, and then we'll go to either Frank or Richard.
Sure. First of all, I'll just do the North Korea threat real quick.
Please.
So we're coming up on the second summit between the president and Kim Jong-un. President Trump likes to highlight, often does highlight the fact that we haven't seen any more flight tests from missiles since the Singapore summit. That is true. That is a great thing. We're all happier when they're not testing missiles, especially the kind that fly over our ally Japan. But there has been no indication from anything that I have seen that the North Koreans have taken steps to dismantle their nuclear missile program, either the nuclear part or their missile part, which I see as hand in glove. You can't separate the two, okay? Because they invest in these monster ICBMs because they want to be able to hold the United States at risk of a nuclear attack. So I have seen no indication that the North Koreans have moved away from desiring to maintain this capability. And in fact, there is some indication from open source, viewing of what's going on, that they continue to perhaps increase capacity. So they're still making missiles. I have no confirmation of that. That's just been reported in the media by others who use commercial satellites to see what they're doing. So I'm still very concerned. I see nothing indicates to me that something has happened with North Korea that would make us less committed to increasing our homeland missile defense to make sure that we take away that ability they have to hold the United States homeland at risk, if that answers your question. And I think that the question that was asked over here, even though she and I might completely disagree on it, I think that is the million-dollar question that everybody who's interested in this subject should be thinking about and sort of chewing on. And then that goes to the third question that was asked. Nothing in the Outer Space Treaty prohibits the United States from putting space-based interceptors in outer space. Nothing. You can go back and look at it. It's talking about weapons of mass destruction in outer space, talking about nuclear capabilities in outer space. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about purely defensive capabilities located in outer space. Okay? And if that violates the treaty, then flying ICBMs that go into exoatmosphere violates the treaty, which they do not. So the Outer Space Treaty has nothing to do with putting defensive capabilities in outer space. I hear that talking point that come up. I hear it in the media. It makes me crazy. It does not do that. We're not talking about violating treaties here. On the strategic stability question, though, the MDR repeatedly says that we believe, and I believe, that missile defense is stabilizing. There is already a gap. Michael talked about there are more offensive missiles than there are defensive capabilities. That's destabilizing. And as our adversaries continue to invest in missile capabilities, we should be looking to devalue those offensive capabilities. How do you do that? Well, you have defensive capabilities. Not the ability to intercept every single one, but again, providing sufficient defense that you create this doubt in their mind that an offensive attack would be worth the cost, either by us intercepting hopefully everything that they can, but at least some of it so that we can then provide limit the damage that they can do and then have an offensive response in retaliation. So all of these things are stabilizing. The Russians have their own missile defense system. This never comes up in conversation. I thought it was cheeky that the MDR included a pretty significant outline of the Russian missile defense program, Chinese missile defense program, the fact that the North Koreans are working on a missile defense program. Why? It's in their interest to do so. So why wouldn't the United States also move forward? And we're not using nukes. The Russians use nukes for their missile defense capabilities. So everything that the United States does is to, again, to prevent a conflict from breaking out in the first place. And in the event that deterrence fails, we have the ability to limit damage, to protect that which we value most to the best of our ability, and have options to respond offensively then in the event that, unfortunately, a military conflict does break down. So that's where I see it. I see it as missile defense at this point can only be viewed as stabilizing in the current threat environment.
Great, thank you. Frank?
You know, with regards to the North Korean threat, I think the MDR takes a number of very, very important steps, which I support. Increasing the number of long-range interceptors by 20 for a total of 64. Deploying more sensors. Sometimes in missile defense, we get too focused on the interceptors. I would argue that the sensors that provide you that more refined discrimination capability are just as important, if not more, because if you have better sensors, that reduces the number of interceptors you need to expend. And I believe that the MDR calls for the deployment of 3 long-range discrimination radars by about 2023. And furthermore, it calls for improvements in the kill vehicle. That is also very, very important. So I think the administration is doing a good job with responding to the threat from North Korea. Now, with regards to Russia, China, and missile defense, I've spent a lot of my career in rooms with the Russians and the Chinese on these issues. They truly believe that the United States is building the Death Star that is circling the Earth with the key objective of undermining their strategic deterrent. Now, some people kind of dismiss this, but there's an old Russian saying, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't out to get you.
The Russian saying?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. I don't know any Russian, but I'll get the translation for you. Listen, I don't see a missile defense solution to the challenge from Russia and China. They have too many missiles, and they have very sophisticated capabilities. We need to rely on nuclear deterrence to deal with Russia and China. And that's why I've been very, very much in favor of the Strategic Modernization Program. Theresa, you're absolutely right about space-based missile defense capabilities. The Russians and the Chinese see space-based missile defense capabilities as an existential threat to their strategic deterrent. And if you look at their space security diplomacy over the last 25 years, all of those efforts, whether it be the prevention of placement of weapons in space treaty or their no first placement resolutions in the United Nations, have been focused on trying to constrain the United States. I would argue that the Russians and the Chinese will do whatever is necessary to maintain an assured second strike capability. Indeed, the investments in hypersonics, from my perspective, by the Russians and the Chinese, are fundamentally about maintaining their ability to penetrate U.S. missile defenses. Rebecca is right on the Outer Space Treaty. It only prevents the deployment of weapons of mass destruction in outer space. There is no prohibition whatsoever on us or other nations deploying missile defense interceptors in space. But the key question is that stabilizing? I am one who has some serious questions about this. When I was at the State Department, I spent a lot of my time engaging countries around the world on the need to have a secure, sustainable, and stable space environment. The Trump administration began pretty well in 2017 talking about the need for space norms and to talk with the Russians and the Chinese on space security. Unfortunately, those words have not been met with action. We are not talking to the Chinese about space security. We are not talking to the Russians on space security. We are not mixing it up in the international arena. I would strongly encourage the administration to take a more active role in space diplomacy. I'm not saying that space diplomacy on its own is going to solve the challenges associated with the Russian and Chinese anti-satellite threat. It will not. But it needs to be part of a comprehensive U.S. space security strategy.
Thank you. And Richard?
Let me start with the North Korea issue. I think I'd put it this way. North Korea's behavior in the last few years got everybody's attention and alarmed an awful lot of people. And that, I take, was their approach. That was what they were trying to do. I think they were trying to get attention on it. What they did in the way of all the testing and the frequency and the different types of missiles and all the new varieties and things that came out and all the surprises, as Rebecca mentioned, with this very large mobile ICBM, that got Congress very focused on North Korea's behavior. And you had very strong support in Congress for addressing these issues. Going back to your question about the $4 billion, well, that was Congress saying, yeah, we need to do something about it, and we need to do it now. So Congress has been sort of seized of this issue, if you will. And my view on this, having spent a lot of time in Congress receiving administration budget requests and watching what's going on, is that right now the North Korea behavior has gotten a very strong level of support for missile defense efforts to defend the United States, certainly the homeland, but also our forces deployed overseas, our allies and partners, against the North Korean threat. And that's largely what motivates an awful lot of the MDR. So I think you're seeing an awful lot of the MDR focused on what do we do now and what we do in the future about this threat. And for that, I suspect Congress will have very strong support, because that's where Congress has been given North Korea's action. And sure, we'd like to see North Korea agree to get rid of its nuclear weapons and missiles, but unless and until that happens, I think this is the path that is likely. On the Russia-China stability, I just want to make one other comment, and frankly, I think you and Rebecca hit a lot of points on this. But there's a basic, there's a fundamental relationship that we always need to keep in mind with missile defense, as well as other elements related to deterrence and trying to dissuade armed conflict, which is there is an action-reaction cycle, right? We know that. Frank mentioned that a lot of what the Russians or Chinese are doing in the way of developing advanced missile technologies seems to be designed to get around our missile defenses, right? General Hyten has made that point publicly many times. So we don't act in isolation or in a vacuum. Our decisions on our defense capabilities, missile defense in this case, are very much driven by our perceptions of what foreign countries are doing, what they may do in the future. So there's sort of this uncertainty and hedging approach. But there's no doubt that those countries will also observe what we do, and they will react, right? And so there will be this dynamic over time, and that may get us to change our view of what makes sense or emphasis or what we should or shouldn't pursue. But I take Frank's point, I agree with it, that if we do something that the Russians or the Chinese perceive would fundamentally threaten their deterrent capability, they will do something to prevent that from happening, as we would. I mean, just put yourself in our shoes and think if the Russians said, aha, we've got something that will completely undermine your deterrent capability, we would not stand for it, right? We couldn't. So.
Just two last points from me, and then we're going to go to one final round. But on North Korea, the Missile Defense Review also talks about exploring a technology that would be based on an unmanned aircraft and would be essentially a kinetic kill vehicle for boost phase intercept, at least looking into the development of such a technology. So that's worth adding to the mix. And then specifically to back up Frank's point, but also to point out the obverse. Yes, boost phase defense based in space worries Russia and China because it's the only kind of boost phase system that could actually be effective against missiles launched from their interior, which are otherwise done burning before they get anywhere close to where we could be. So that's the physics of why they worry. But the other part of the physics story is that to be close enough to shoot down a missile with any technology that I know of that's even foreseen, you have to be in low orbit, which means you're usually out of position. Anything in low orbit is moving around the Earth all the time, which means you need 20, 30, 40 of these things in space to have one in the right spot. Therefore, the economics work very badly against the defense for any technology I'm aware of today. That could change, but that's the way I see it. So I'm not trying to argue so much with the Russians and the Chinese, but just to underscore some of the constraints and limitations on boost phase defense. So we'll go to one last round here. I think we'll take about 3 questions and then go back to the panel for wrap-up. Gentleman here, and then we'll come over to, actually, you guys already had your questions, so I'll come over here and then to the back, if I could.
Yes, Mark Bucknam with the National War College. The Missile Defense Review calls for this long-range prompt strike capability. Now, the U.S. has been saying that it needs that, or DoD has been saying it needs that, going back at least to the 2006 QDR, right? And we've got nothing. We've got nada. So presumably, if we're going to integrate offense and defense and have some sort of attack ops with a prompt long-range strike capability, we're going to have to field something, either something that violates the INF treaty or that's hypersonic. And so what do you think that the U.S. should field to produce this capability, and what limitations would you advise the administration to put on those sorts of things so as not to be destabilizing?
Thank you. The gentleman here in the front row.
Hi, Dwayne Neal, Booz Allen Hamilton. I had a question in regard to the space sensor layer. I agree. I mean, it seems very intuitive. We have to go to space for a lot of this. My only concern, I was wondering if you all could address it, is whether that becomes somewhat of a Maginot Line, given how predictable some of the orbits are, the growth of ASAT technologies, and how any destruction of those satellites could lead to cascading effects with other uses of space for us.
And then finally, in the back.
Hi, Rizwan Lada, fellow at George Mason University. As I've heard you talk about the challenges we have from a budgetary and domestic political standpoint versus some of the calls in the MDR for advancing or examining new technologies, what do you see to be the role of industry in advancing some of these concepts and getting to a point of initial operational capability? Rapid prototyping, relying more on companies' own internal research and development dollars, bringing in outside private funding, et cetera. There may be some ideas you have on how we get over the budget hurdle while still advancing our missile defense mission. Thank you.
So with apologies to others that we don't have time to call on, let me now go back to the panel, and everybody could please just take 2 to 3 minutes to wrap up, so please be selective of which questions you address, starting with Richard and working down.
Okay. Role of industry, advanced technology. Typically, industry is seen as the brain trust of interesting new ideas, and I don't imagine that that's going to change, right? I mean, I think the Defense Department has always partnered with industry and asked them to bring good, new, innovative ideas, concepts, and I have no reason to expect that would change. That's a long-standing relationship. On the space sensor layer or space-based sensors, I guess one of my surprises in the MDR was that it didn't spend more time on that. Every time, as I read through it, it was talking about the benefits of space sensors. It quick jumped to, oh, and by the way, space-based interceptors may be a really beneficial capability. So I was a little surprised there wasn't more in here. Congress has directed the development of a space sensor architecture, and I think has pushed much further than that. So I see this as the direction that Congress is pushing the department, and the department wants to go anyway. And I assume that we'll probably see the real answer on that in the upcoming budget request. But I think that's a pretty well-established direction going forward. And on the attack ops and prompt strike, this is an issue that has been discussed for a long time. And I remember having lots of discussions on this on the Hill years and years ago. And it's taken a long time to develop. I don't know what the solution will be. I assume that this will be something that has the services involved. Army, Air Force, Navy will all be part of this discussion. It's actually one of the taskings of the MDR to look at this question and figure it out. And so there's an awful lot of homework in this MDR. 6 to 9 months from now, a whole lot of reports are going to be dropped on desks around the Pentagon with all kinds of suggestions. And I'm presuming that those answers, because they haven't been given yet, won't be reflected in the upcoming budget. But I would think within the next year, we'll have a better idea of what the intention is for that kind of capability. I don't think that anybody really knows right now. I don't. I'll put it that way.
Rebecca, over to you.
Can everybody hear me still? My microphone popped off. Okay. I wanted to just make one quick comment again on the stability thing after my two co-panelists talked about it. I will say that the alternative to not closing what I see as a deterrent gap that exists, either with what the United States has done in the nuclear posture review to try to handle some of what Russia is doing with low-yield weapons in theater, and also what the Russians and Chinese are doing with hypersonics, especially as the Chinese try to hold at risk U.S. carriers. We're trying to close that gap. The alternative is to allow our adversaries to have the advantage in this particular dynamic. So those are our options before us are, do we seek defensives to try to close that gap, or do we allow the scenario to remain as is with our adversaries being able to hold at risk such high value things that the United States values, whether it's our carriers abroad or our allies. And then on the Russia and China, I mean, the Russians oppose Aegis Ashore in Romania and Poland. The Chinese oppose THAAD in South Korea. They throw a fit every time we increase our defenses with our Japanese partners with Aegis. The SM-32A now that we've been working with the Japanese, we're going to be testing against an ICBM class target mentioned in the Missile Defense Review. They're going to be upset about that kind of thing. I mean, the Russians and the Chinese are going to oppose missile defense every step of the way. So if that's going to be the argument that we hold on to not build U.S. defenses, I think we might as well just stop and pack it up and go home, which I argue is not in the interest of the United States of America. So that's how.
Great.
Good closing comment.
Just 4 quick points. One, with regards to industry, I think cooperation with industry is key. Perhaps there are some lessons that missile defense can take from the space industry. We have Virgin Galactic and a number of other space companies that are really making some dynamic changes in lowering the cost to have access to space. So perhaps there are some lessons there. On the space-based sensor layer, if we can get it to work, it will dramatically improve our ability to conduct missile defense operations. But the ASAT threat is growing. The Russians and the Chinese and others know the advantages that the United States gets from space. That's one of the reasons why they are investing in anti-satellite capabilities. And, at the beginning, at the end of the Obama administration and throughout the Trump administration, we've been looking at efforts to improve the resiliency of those systems, and I think that is key. With regards to deep strike capabilities, I absolutely agree. We need to develop the deep strike capabilities that can hold Russian and Chinese targets at risk. In my piece on the Missile Defense Review, where I question the administration's focus on trying to defend against the Russian and Chinese regional threat, I talk about the need to develop perhaps a conventional variant of the long-range standoff nuclear cruise missile that can hold at risk key Russian targets. And finally, let me just make a point about allies and partners. The Missile Defense Review has some great language on cooperation with allies and partners. Indeed, I think it's some of the best language that I have seen in any U.S. missile defense policy document. But here's the challenge. President Trump has been very, very critical of our allies. Specifically at the missile defense rollout event at the Pentagon, he used that as an opportunity to criticize the allies for not spending enough on defense. Now listen, if there's anybody in Washington who's been banging the tin cup on missile defense cooperation for the last 20 years, it's been me. But we also need to remember the important role that our allies play in defending the United States homeland. The radars in Greenland, the United Kingdom, and Japan directly support the defense of the United States homeland from ballistic missile threats. And the President should be reminded of that fact.
Very good. Another great point to finish on. Well, thank you all for being here today, and please join me in thanking the panel.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.